I create dark, extreme horror stories, and for just $1, you can help me keep the horror alive. It's like buying me a terrifying cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, please consider donating. My PayPal link is in the description. Due to YouTube guidelines, it's difficult to create R-rated content, so I kindly request you to join me on Patreon for just $1. The village of Halewood was no ordinary place. Nestled deep in the heart of a dense, shadowy forest, it existed on the fringes of the world, forgotten by time and haunted by an ancient evil. The air hung thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that howled through the trees like a mournful dirge. For centuries, Halewood had stood isolated, cut off from the modern world by an overwhelming sense of dread that permeated the very soil. The locals knew better than to speak of the darkness that lurked beyond the forest, a malevolent force tied to an ancient ritual, a curse that had claimed countless lives. Outsiders were not welcome, not because of the villagers' hostility, but out of fear. Fear that those who entered Halewood's cursed grounds would never return. No one believed the stories anymore, of course. Legends passed down over generations had a way of losing their potency, turning into mere ghost tales to scare children. But the village's sinister reputation lived on, drawing in thrill seekers and paranormal enthusiasts. It was this dark allure that had brought Ethan and his team of investigators to Halewood, and now, they would wish they had never come. Ethan, tall and confident, had always been drawn to the paranormal. His crew, Lucas, a tech-savvy skeptic, Sarah, a fearless journalist with a love for horror, and Cassie, a sensitive who claimed to be able to feel spirits, followed him into the village. Their van packed with cameras, recording equipment, and curiosity. Halewood was everything they expected and more. It was desolate, crumbling, and seemingly abandoned. "This place is a ghost town," Lucas muttered, adjusting his camera strap. His tone was flippant, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Exactly why we're here," Ethan replied, scanning the area. He took out a worn map, one of the few remaining records of Halewood's location. "There's supposed to be a manor at the..." Cassie, silent for most of the trip, shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "This place, it's wrong. The air feels heavy." Sarah, always practical, scoffed. "It's just an old village. Probably damp and full of mold." But as they walked deeper into Halewood, a creeping sense of dread took root. The village was dead, no sounds of life, no birds, no animals. The air itself felt stagnant, as if trapped in some timeless void. As they approached the manor, an oppressive silence fell over them. The manor loomed like a tomb, its stone walls covered in ivy, the windows shattered and dark. Ethan hesitated for the first time, a feeling of unease clawing at him. But it was too late to turn back now. The interior of the manor was worse than they imagined. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls seemed to pulse with the weight of centuries. As they set up their equipment in the grand hall, Cassie's unease deepened. "There's something here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can feel it. It's watching us." Ethan ignored her, focused on the task at hand. "Let's get started. Sarah, you're on EVP recordings. Lucas, I want infrared cameras set up in every room. Cassie, you stay close to me. We're going to the basement." "The basement?" Cassie's voice wavered. "Why there?" "That's where the ritual was performed," Ethan said, pulling out an old, brittle journal. According to the records, the villagers used this manor for a sacrificial rite. They believed it kept the forest spirit appeased. "What kind of sacrifice?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "Human," Ethan replied grimly. "They offered their own to the spirit, in exchange for protection. But something went wrong. The spirit turned against them, cursing the village and trapping the souls of the sacrificed. Lucas snorted. Come on, Ethan. You don't really buy into this, do you? Pale face said otherwise. She had been unnervingly quiet, her gaze fixed on the basement door. It's not a legend, she whispered. It's real. And we shouldn't be here. Despite Cassie's warnings, Ethan led the group into the basement. The stone stairs were cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. As they descended, the sense of wrongness grew stronger, like a presence lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. The basement was vast, stretching out into darkness. In the center of the room, an altar stood, a crude stone slab stained with what looked like centuries-old blood. Surrounding it were markings etched into the floor, symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. We're getting something, Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement as she held up the EVP recorder. Static crackled through the speakers, followed by a low, guttural moan. Cassie flinched, her hand flying to her mouth. No. What is it? Lucas asked, unnerved for the first time. It's them, Cassie said, her voice barely above a whisper. The souls of the sacrificed. They're trapped here. Before anyone could react, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath came out in frosty puffs, and the lights on their cameras flickered. We need to leave, Cassie said urgently, backing toward the stairs. Now. But it was too late, the basement door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a death knell. Ethan ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The cameras, Lucas started, but then his voice cut off, replaced by a blood-curdling scream. He fell to the floor, convulsing as if something unseen was attacking him. Lucas. Ethan shouted, rushing to his side, but there was nothing he could do. Lucas's body writhed in agony, his eyes rolling back into his head, as dark shadows swirled around him. Suddenly, Lucas went still. His chest stopped rising, and his eyes stared blank in his chest as he felt for a pulse, but there was none. Lucas was dead, panic set in. Sarah screamed and backed away from Lucas's lifeless body, while Cassie sobbed in terror. Ethan tried to stay calm, but the horror of what was happening began to sink in. The air in the basement grew thick with a dark, oppressive energy. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, pulsing with life, and the shadows around them seemed to move with intent. We have to get out of here. Sarah cried, frantically pulling at the door. But it wouldn't open. They won't let us leave, Cassie whispered, her voice broken. We're part of the ritual now. We've awakened the entity, and it wants more souls. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a form, a tall, grotesque figure with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. It moved with unnatural speed, its limbs contorting as it approached them. Ethan grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the altar. Cassie. We need to find a way out. Now. But Cassie didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the figure, her face pale with terror. It's here. The spirit. The one they summoned. It's hungry. The entity reached for her, its skeletal fingers brushing against her skin. Cassie let out a choked scream as her body was lifted into the air, suspended by an unseen force. Her limbs twisted unnaturally, and blood began to seep from her eyes and mouth. Ethan and Sarah watched in horror as Cassie's body was torn apart, her screams filling the room. The entity consumed her, its hollow eyes glowing with a sickening hunger. Ethan and Sarah were the only ones left, trapped in the basement with the entity. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the oppressive energy of the cursed ground weighed down on them. We have to find a way out, Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. There has to be another exit. But the shadows seemed to close in on them, the entity drawing nearer flickered to life. The screen showed a faint outline of a hidden door on the far side of the basement. There. She shouted. There's a way out. They ran toward the hidden door, the entity closing in behind them. Ethan pushed against the stone, but it wouldn't budge. Come on. Sarah cried, shoving against the door with all her strength. The entity was almost upon them, its hollow eyes glowing with malice. Ethan could feel its cold breath on the back of his neck as he pushed one last time, and the door gave way. They stumbled into a narrow tunnel, the light of dawn visible in the distance. But the entity was not done with them. It reached through the doorway. Its long, skeletal fingers wrapping around Sarah's ankle, she screamed, kicking at the hand as Ethan pulled her free. Together, they ran toward the light, the entity's rage echoing behind them. They burst out of the tunnel and into the forest, gasping for breath. The manor loomed behind them, its dark silhouette standing like a tombstone against the rising sun, but as they looked back, they realized the entity had not followed. The curse of Halewood had not crossed the threshold of the village. They were safe, or so they thought. Days later, Ethan and Sarah sat in a diner miles away from Halewood, their faces pale and their eyes haunted by what they had witnessed. They had survived the cursed grounds. But the horror lingered in their minds. As they drank their coffee in silence, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text message from Cassie. The message was short, but the words sent a chill down her spine. You can never leave. Ethan's phone buzzed next. The same message appeared on his screen. As they looked up at each other in horror, the lights in the diner flickered and the shadows began to move. The message from Cassie burned into Sarah's mind, freezing her blood. Ethan dropped his phone, his face ash on the linoleum floor of the diner felt far away, drowned out by the pounding of his heart. They were hundreds of miles from Halewood, but the dread that had haunted the village now seemed to have followed them, lingering in the air, unseen but undeniably present. Sarah glanced around the diner. The atmosphere had shifted, the gentle clinking of silverware on plates, the low hum of conversation, all of it had gone unnaturally quiet. Every pair of eyes in the room seemed to be watching them now, dull and lifeless, as if the people around them weren't quite real anymore. The lights flickered again, a sickly fluorescent buzz overhead. She could feel it. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong, Ethan, she whispered, voice shaking. We need to leave. Now. But Ethan couldn't move. His gaze was still fixed on the message, on the words that shouldn't be possible. You can never leave, that can't be her, he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. Cassie's dead. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him out of his daze. We saw her die, Ethan. This isn't real, it can't be. We have to get out of here before she could finish her sentence. The lights in the diner flickered one last time and then went out completely, plunging the room into pitch darkness. For a moment, the diner was completely silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the temperature dropped. Cold, far colder than it had any right to be inside the building, began to seep into Sarah's bones. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, suffocating. Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't see him, but she could feel his presence next to her, tense and frozen with fear. We need to move. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against the cool metal edge of the table. She groped for Ethan's hand but found nothing. Panic surged through her. The lights flickered back on with a harsh, buzzing hum, but the diner was no longer the safe, mundane place they had entered. The patrons, once normal and unassuming, now sat unnaturally still, their faces pale and waxy like mannequins. Their eyes were glassy, staring blankly ahead. The room smelled of rot, an overpowering stench of decay that churned Sarah's stomach, and Ethan, he was gone. Sarah's heart raced as her eyes darted around the diner. Where had he gone? Had he been taken? Her mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Slow, deliberate, and unnatural. One of the patrons, a woman who had been sitting at the counter moments earlier, slowly turned her head towards Sarah, her neck cracking as if the movement was too much for her fragile body. The woman's mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, her lips splitting as blood dribbled down her chin. "Ethan." The woman croaked, her voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. "He's already gone." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. The patrons, all of them now, were turning their heads toward her, their dead eyes following her every move. "We are all waiting," another voice whispered from across the room, its source obscured by shadow. "We have been waiting for you." Sarah bolted for the door, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she couldn't hear her own frantic footsteps. She shoved the door open and burst out into the cold night air. She expected to be greeted by the sight of the familiar street outside, the sounds of passing cars, the faint glow of streetlights, but what she found was far worse. The world outside the diner was gone. Instead of the comforting glow of streetlights and the hum of distant traffic, Sarah was met with a sprawling, mist-shrouded smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, a thick fog curling around her feet like tendrils of smoke. The forest was eerily quiet, the trees looming like twisted, skeletal figures, their branches reaching toward the sky in grotesque shapes. She was back. Back in Halewood, no. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. Her mind raced. Had they ever left the village? Or had they been trapped in its cursed grasp from the moment they entered the manor? The diner, the escape, it had all been an illusion, a cruel trick played by the malevolent entity that haunted the cursed grounds. A rustling sound came from the trees, snapping her back to the present. Something was moving in the fog, something big. Sarah's pulse quickened. She turned to run, but as she did, the fog thickened, swirling around her like a living thing. Her footsteps faltered as the fog pulled her in every direction, confusing her sense of direction. The trees seemed to shift, their shapes warping and twisting in the gloom, as if the forest itself were alive, rearranging itself to keep her trapped. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then, silence. Sarah froze, every muscle in her body tense. She strained to listen, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The fog parted slightly, and through the mist, she saw it, a figure. At first, it looked human, standing motionless among the trees. But as the fog thinned further, revealing more of the figure, Sarah's stomach twisted in horror. It was Ethan, or at least, something that looked like Ethan. He stood there, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes hollow and dead. His clothes were torn and stained with dirt and blood, his skin stretched tight over his bones as if something had drained him of life. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. No. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her then, without warning, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Come back to us, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice a hollow echo of what it once was. "We're waiting for you." Sarah backed away, shaking her head. "You're not real. You're not real." But Ethan stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The fog swirled around him as he moved closer, and with each step, his body seemed to warp and distort. His skin began to peel away, revealing rotting flesh beneath. His eyes sunk deeper into his skull, black as voids, and his once familiar features melted into something monstrous. "Stay with us, Sarah," the thing that had once been Ethan hissed. "You'll never leave." Sarah turned and ran, her legs burning as she sprinted through the fog-choked forest. Branches clawed at her skin, the mist stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She didn't know where she was going, there was no clear path, no exit, but staying meant certain death. The sound of something following her grew louder, the steady crunch of leaves and snapping twigs echoing in her ears. She didn't dare look back. Her chest ached, her lungs screamed for air, but she kept running until the ground beneath her gave way. With a gasp, she fell, tumbling down a steep embankment. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her limbs as she landed at the bottom. The fog swirled around her, thicker here, almost suffocating. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, through the haze of pain and disorientation, Sarah heard something, a low, whispering chant, coming from somewhere in the fog. The sound was faint at first, like a distant breeze, but it grew louder, more insistent, filling her ears with its chilling melody. She struggled to her feet, her body trembling, and looked around. The fog parted just enough to reveal a shape in the distance. It was old, decrepit, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. The manor. She had been running in circles. The forest, the fog, the entire village, it was all part of the curse. There was no escape. Not by normal means. The chanting grew louder as Sarah stumbled toward the manor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air felt thicker here, heavier, as if the very ground was charged with dark energy. She had no choice. She had to go back. She had to face whatever awaited her inside. The manor loomed before her like a mausoleum, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. The chanting was deafening now, seeming to come from every direction. The door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan as Sarah stepped inside. The door closed behind Sarah with a deafening slam, cutting off any chance of escape. The oppressive silence in the manor was suffocating. The air was thick with decay, a scent that clung to her skin like death itself. Every step felt weighted, as if unseen hands were trying to drag her down. The chanting grew louder, swirling around her like a malevolent wind, rising from the floor, the walls, even the shadows. It wasn't in a language she recognized, but the words reverberated deep inside her skull, igniting a primal fear. She wasn't alone. Her pulse quickened as she moved through the grand, decaying halls of the manor. The once elegant interior was now a ruin of splintered wood and mold-covered wallpaper. She could feel eyes on her, watching her from every corner of the room, but there was no one there. "Ethan?" Sarah whispered, though she already knew the answer. Whatever had taken him was no longer human. As she reached the grand staircase, the air grew colder. Fog began to seep into the room, thick and heavy, snaking along the floor. The walls trembled, the symbols glowing brighter, pulsing in sync with the chanting. Then, from the top of the staircase, a shadow emerged. It was the thing that had once been Ethan. His body was grotesquely contorted, his face split by a monstrous grin, and his eyes, once warm and full of life, were now hollow, black pits. He moved jerkily. Like a marionette controlled by invisible strings, descending the stairs with unnatural slowness. "Sarah," Ethan's voice rasped, a mockery of its former self. "Why do you run from me?" Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're not Ethan," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. You're just a thing wearing his face." The thing that was once Ethan let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound echoing through the manor. "We all become part of it in the end," it crooned, its voice slithering into her. "There is no escape from this place. There never was." Sarah's back hit the cold wall behind her. There was nowhere left to go. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but the door was locked, the window sealed. The shadows seemed to be closing in on her, pressing against her skin, filling her lungs. "I didn't ask for this," Sarah choked, her voice shaking. "We didn't mean to come here. We didn't know." The creature's smile widened, splitting its face open until it was almost inhuman. "Ignorance is no excuse," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You entered. That's all that matters." The chanting swelled, growing louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was responding to the presence of the entity. The fog curled tighter around Sarah's feet, cold and suffocating. Ethan, or what had once been Ethan, reached out a twisted, skeletal hand, fingers elongated and sharp. "You'll join us soon," he rasped, his voice a sick mockery of the boy she had once known. "We all do." Sarah's skin crawled as the hand came closer, but something deep inside her stirred, a memory, something Cassie had said before everything went wrong. "The house only takes what you give it." Sarah's eyes snapped open. The house only took what it was offered. The others had become part of it because they had surrendered. But she hadn't. "Not yet, you don't control me," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "You can't make me stay." The creature's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. "I won't be part of this," Sarah continued, backing up slowly toward the grand staircase. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was a spark of resolve in her now. "I won't let you take me." The shadows around her flickered, uncertain, as if the house itself was hesitating. The chanting wavered, faltering in its rhythm. Then, without warning, Sarah turned and sprinted up the staircase. She didn't know where she was going. She knew she couldn't stay in the hall any longer. The creature let out a furious howl behind her, the sound inhuman, echoing through the halls like a banshee's wail. The house trembled, the walls warping and shifting as if it was trying to trap her within its cursed embrace. But Sarah kept running, her breath ragged and her legs burning. Every door she passed slammed shut, the floor groaning under her weight. She reached the top of the staircase and paused, her heart racing. The hallway ahead of her stretched impossibly long, the walls bending and twisting in unnatural ways. Doors lined the corridor, each one identical, but she knew none of them led to safety. Not in a place like this. Then, at the far end of the hall, she saw it, the mirror. It was the same ornate, antique mirror they had seen when they first entered the house. But now, its surface was cracked and dark, swirling with shadows like a portal to another world. The closer Sarah got, the more the mirror seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its fractured glass reflecting twisted versions of her own face. She hesitated for a moment, her body screaming for her to turn back. But something about the mirror called to her, pulling her forward. "The house only takes what you give it." Sarah realized what she had to do. The chanting grew louder, the floor shaking violently beneath her feet. Behind her, the creature, Ethan, was crawling up the stairs, its body contorting in ways no human body should be able to. Its bones cracked and snapped as it moved, its limbs bending at impossible angles. "Sarah," it rasped, its voice warped and broken. "Come back." But Sarah ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror. She stepped closer, her reflection shifting and warping in the cracked glass. The shadows within the mirror swirled faster now, like a whirlpool of darkness, pulling her in. She could feel the house's energy surrounding her, pressing down on her chest, trying to. Sarah wasn't going to give it the satisfaction. With a scream, she raised her fist and brought it down on the mirror with all the strength she had left. The glass shattered, exploding outward in a shower of jagged shards. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the house screamed. It was a sound like nothing Sarah had ever heard, a deep, guttural roar that shook the walls, rattling the very foundation of the manor. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of it, the symbols on the floor flaring to life in a blaze of crimson light. The creature behind her howled in pain, its twisted body convulsing as the house's power began to unravel. The shadows that had clung to the walls recoiled. Swirling into a chaotic storm of darkness and light, Sarah stumbled backward, watching in horror as the house began to collapse in on itself. The walls cracked and splintered, the ceiling caving in as the floor beneath her feet trembled violently. The entity, the thing that had once been Ethan, let out one final, anguished wail before it was consumed by the darkness, swallowed whole by the collapsing manor. The chanting faded, replaced by a deafening silence. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Sarah awoke to the sound of birds chirping. She blinked against the soft morning light, disoriented. The ground beneath her was soft and damp, the smell of earth and pine filling her nose. She was lying in the middle of the forest, the ruins of the manor nowhere in sight. Had it all been a dream? She sat up slowly, her body aching. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear blue sky above. The forest was still, peaceful, as if the horrors of the night had never happened, but something was wrong. As Sarah stood, she felt a weight in her chest, a cold, sinking feeling that told her the nightmare wasn't truly over. She glanced down at her hands. They were trembling, her fingers ghostly pale. Her skin felt cold, too cold, and whisper, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind, "You can never leave." Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. The forest around her darkened, the shadows stretching long and ominous. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing just behind her, was a figure, Ethan, or what was left of him. His hollow eyes stared into hers, his lips twisting into that same grotesque smile. "We're waiting for you, Sarah," he whispered, his voice echoing in her mind. "We're always waiting." Sarah backed away, her pulse racing, but she knew it was futile. The house had let her go, but she would never truly be free. The curse of Halewood had marked her, and it would follow her forever.